The Great Flood story in Genesis is one of the most well-known stories of the Bible. Most people from a Christian or Jewish culture know the story. It tells of a time where people became so sinful, God thought it best to wipe them away. But he decided to save Noah and his family by warning him over the coming flood and telling him to build an ark to save his family and the animals of the world. But Noah's story isn't the only story about a great flood from the ancient world. They are not all alike, but many tell of someone being forewarned of an impending disaster and then preparing for it and saving their family and animals and then repopulating the earth afterwards. I think the Great Flood was a worldwide event, although I don't necessarily think the whole world was completely covered by water at the same time. The flood story in Genesis was most likely describing a regional event. Some faithful think it is necessary to believe the flood covered the whole planet, but the people the story is written to didn't know how large the planet was, so they wouldn't have necessarily understood how widespread the flooding was, just that the world as they knew it was flooded. Even though it says all the earth was flooded, similar phrasing is used elsewhere in the Bible, like when it says all the earth came to Egypt. Most people don't think that literally every person in the world came to Egypt, just that people from all around the world known to them were going to Egypt at the time. So in context, saying all the earth was flooded could just mean that all the world they knew of was flooded. Also, the Greek word for world could mean the whole world or just a specific region of land. Being the Genesis story is likely a regional description of events, this might also help explain how Noah was able to take all the animal types on his ark. He likely did not literally bring each kind of animal in existence on the entire planet at that time onto the ark, just the animal types of his region. Other stories of people sheltering animals during the flood exist around the world. This may indicate that others around the world did the same thing that Noah did. Many have long been under the impression that Noah is the only human to survive the flood, but being that the Genesis story is an origin story of the Hebrew people, it's possible Noah was just the only direct ancestor of the Hebrew people to survive the flood, not necessarily the only human on the entire planet to survive. Although many of these stories tell of people sheltering animals from the flood, they might not have been able to rescue them all. This might have even been what caused the megafauna extinction around 11,000 years ago. Perhaps no one was able to save large animals like mammoths. I've wondered if what scientists consider to be the end of the Ice Age is when the birth of Adam was, and then maybe the Great Flood when the Younger Dryas period began. Perhaps the beginning of the Younger Dryas is when God formed the earth to be a bit more of a hospitable climate, basically like the beginning of Genesis. From Adam to the flood is approximately 1,600 years, maybe a little bit more than that. It's not the exact calculation, but from the end of the glacial maximum to the end of the Younger Dryas was approximately 1,250 years. And I don't know that that's necessarily an exact date either. It's just kind of a range they've come up with. It's kind of similar to me in time frame. The Adam to flood's a little bit longer, but in geological years, I don't think it's that big of a difference. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter says the world was formed out of water and by water, and then by those waters the world was destroyed by the great flood. This may reference the time prior to the Younger Dryas, and then the flood at the end of the Younger Dryas. So maybe that story is actually talking about a period of time during the Younger Dryas. I don't know that. It's just something I've kind of a thought experiment or some speculation, whatever you want to call it, that I came up with when I was researching this. The Younger Dryas event would have been around 12,000 years ago, maybe a little longer, maybe like 13 or 14,000 years ago. I want to go ahead and get this out of the way and say I don't think the Genesis story is a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh story. A lot of academic historians think the Genesis story is a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh because it's written at an earlier time and in the same region of the world. And actually, the flood story with Utnapishtim, which is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, itself might be a copy of another ancient story called the Atrahasis. There are several known fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and not all of them are identical. The Utnapishtim story was likely added later in what is known as the late version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, found in Nineveh around the 7th century BC. Scholar Geoffrey Tigay says that the literary structure of the Utnapishtim story in the Epic of Gilgamesh is not consistent with the rest of the epic, indicating it was probably added in the late version by an editor. Sure, there are similarities in the Gilgamesh story and the Genesis story, but there are differences too. The Genesis story isn't dependent on the Gilgamesh story from a literary standpoint, such as borrowing vocabulary or style in the same way that the Utnapishtim story is dependent on the Atrahasis. I think the Genesis and Gilgamesh flood stories are different, independent accounts of the same event. There's also another story from that region about a guy named Ziusudra, or also called Zinsudu. He was the last king before the flood, and he was warned of the impending disaster by Enki. His story is older than the Epic of Gilgamesh, and may be the same person named Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So Noah and Utnapishtim are the most famous of the ancient flood stories, but there's hundreds of these flood stories from around the world. I don't know if all of these are necessarily all about the same worldwide event, but I think a lot of them are. The researcher Dr. Richard Andre concluded that out of 86 different flood stories from around the world, 62 were entirely independent of the Mesopotamian and Hebrew accounts. I'm not sure which ones he reviewed, but I'll list some other ones here from around the world. In Jewish legend outside of the biblical story, the fallen angels had a dream where they saw a rock cover the earth. The dream was about the coming of the Great Flood. It's possible the rock may refer to a meteorite or comet impacting the earth and causing the flooding. The Edfu texts in Egypt tell of a long ago time when the gods did not live in Egypt but on a sacred island in the ocean. At some point, a cataclysm took place and flooded the island, destroying everything on it, and the survivors were left to wander the world and recreate their lost home. This story is also reminiscent of the fall of Atlantis, which was written by Plato, but he learned it from Solon, who had learned it from an Egyptian priest. It's likely this is the same story. A Greek story of Deucalion says the current race of men is not the first one, and a previous race of men had existed that become so sinful they were destroyed by a flood, but Deucalion and his family survived by getting in a great vessel with various animals who sought refuge with them. In Norse mythology, one story says, and when Ymir fell, so much blood flowed from his wounds that it drowned all of the Jotnar except one that escaped with his household. Giants called him Bergelmir. He and his wife went to his ark and were saved, and from them are descended the families of all of Jotnar. The Indian fish god Matsaya rescued Manu during the Great Flood. The Buryat of Mongolia have a story where a man named Shutkut was forewarned by a heavenly source to go into the forest and build a large ship that he could bring all animals on. The only animal that refused was the mammoth because it was so large, so the mammoth went extinct after the flood came. The Tatars of Siberia have a story about a man named Nama who built a ship with 8 cables, each 80 fathoms long. The cables snapped 7 days later when the water had risen 480 feet. Only the tops of the mountains could be seen. The Ugrians and Ostyaks of Siberia tell how some people survived on rafts or logs, and then settled different parts of the earth when the waters receded, and different languages developed because of this across the world. The Wichita of Oklahoma tell of clouds that came, and the flood was all over the earth. A wise man was forewarned and prepared for the flood by collecting seeds and animals into a protective vessel. When the waters receded, he and his wife came down from the mountain and repopulated the earth. The Toltecs told of a story of men being destroyed by tremendous rains and lightning, and all the land, including the mountains, being covered by water. The men who escaped and repopulated the world then built a high tower afterwards to take refuge in, should the world be flooded again. Their language was confused after that, and they moved to different parts of the earth. I think you can see the obvious similarity there with the Genesis story of the flood, as well as the Tower of Babel story after it. They also said this age lasted 1,716 years, which isn't all that far off from the timing from Adam to the flood in the Bible. And the Toltec civilization was already gone by the time the Spanish arrived, so this story wouldn't have been adapted from the Spanish. The Aztecs believed in multiple eras of history, each previous era ending in destruction. The era known as the fourth sun ended in a flood, and mountains disappeared and men were turned into fish. The only two survivors of the story, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce these right, probably not, but the only two survivors of the story were Coxcutli and his wife, Akishkiketzel. I'm sure I did that terribly, but anyways, those two had been forewarned by a god of the coming flood and escaped in a huge boat, which later came to rest on a tall mountain. After the flood receded, they came down from the mountain and had many children. Native people of the Lake Titicaca region reported that there was a flood that drowned all men. Viracocha appeared in human form from Lake Titicaca and created the sun and moon and stars, and after that renewed the human population. I think creating the sun and moon and stars in this instance may be referring to clouds dispersing after a long period of time of the sky being darkened by clouds. The Popol Vuh of the Mayans also talks of multiple eras and one destroyed by flood. The Popol Vuh also associates the flood with indescribable cold. So if the flood didn't actually cover the entire lands of the earth with water, are there any other stories from places that weren't flooded? Graham Hancock does highlight some other similar stories in his book, The Fingerprints of the Gods, describing a long winter of harsh cold conditions. In South America, the Toba people tell of a semi-divine hero who warned a man of a great cold that was coming and to cover his hut with a thick layer of thatch and shut himself inside. When the long darkness came, other people died of starvation. The Avestic scriptures of Zoroastrianism tell of a time when Ahura Mazda created the first good and happy creation that flourished in the first age. The happiness of that age was destroyed by a 10-month winter with deep snows. Similar to the flood myths, Ahura Mazda warned Yima that the long winter was coming and instructed him to make an underground structure to shelter men and animals. An ark is appropriate for a flood, but an underground structure is appropriate for a long winter when everything is frozen over. The Zoroastrian text Bundahish also tells of the skies being darkened and ice sheets encroaching on the land. It may not be a coincidence that the huge underground city of Derinkuyu was found in Turkey, not all that far from Persia. It might not be the city that Yima built, but it might have been built for the same event. Derinkuyu has storerooms, stables, wine presses, 15,000 ventilation shafts, and is estimated to be able to house around 20,000 people. Another large underground city found in Midyat, Mardin, Turkey, has had 49 rooms and many corridors excavated, but it's estimated that what has been uncovered only accounts for around 3% of the city. It's been estimated that 60 to 70,000 people could have lived in the underground city. The archaeologist Dr. Heinrich Kusch said that evidence of Stone Age tunnels have been found all across Europe, and thinks that because so many tunnels have survived until the present day, the original tunnel network across Europe must have been enormous. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the archaeology here, but a lot of the archaeology of what would be a pre-flood civilization is likely to be underwater, because a lot of civilizations would have built near water, and when the waters rose, the civilizations would have been wiped out. There's a lot of stuff that you can find about that. Graham Hancock wrote a book called Underworld, where he's doing underwater archaeology, and it's also a documentary. You can find a lot of other articles of things being found underwater, like an 11,000-year-old sediment found at the bottom of the Baltic Sea and called Sweden's Atlantis. There's also a place they call Britain's Atlantis, found at the bottom of the North Sea. It was supposedly from like 6,500 BC. There's places in the Mediterranean that have got civilizations underwater too. So whatever happened, whether it was the end of the Ice Age or like a meteorite hitting and making the waters flood, or, it might all be kind of the same event. Most of those civilizations We're likely underwater now, so if you're going to find them, that's where you would look. And I'm not really going to elaborate on all of that here, but I'll post some links in the description where you can go look at some more of that stuff if you want to. But the next thing here is, what exactly caused this flood? What was the catalyst? Volcanism and earthquakes are often associated with flood stories, but these aren't necessarily the cause of the floods. These too may have been consequences of something else, much like the flooding. So many of the stories point to the cause being a divine decision, but perhaps even a divine act can be brought about by physical means. So what are some possibilities here? One is a meteorite storm. Scientists found evidence of a meteorite storm that hit the Earth more than 12,000 years ago. The heat from the impacts caused melt glass to form, which occurs at 1700 degrees, like an atomic bomb. The impacts may have been what triggered the cold snap in temperatures of the Younger Dryas period. Material was found in South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and as far away as Syria. Another possibility is a comet impact. It's possible a crater in Greenland might even be the impact crater of the comet. If you look at the Younger Dryas boundary field on a map, a comet hitting Greenland might fit that boundary field as well. I think it might also be a possible explanation of what the Carolina Bays are. Carolina Bays are small, crater-like circles that can be seen scattered around the ground along the eastern United States, particularly in the Carolinas region. If a comet was coming in, smaller bits of ice from its tail may have impacted the Earth and then melted away, leaving little evidence other than the circular impressions that can be seen from satellite imagery. Massive impacts like this could be what would trigger flooding and, just climate change in general that would ripple around the world. So different regions of the world may have experienced the event a little bit differently. What I was interested in here was a historical look at the story of the Great Flood. The story in Genesis is the first story of the event that I ever heard, and the one I'm most familiar with. Although many modern atheists and mainstream academic historians may be skeptical of the story itself, I think a lot of their skepticism may result from a misunderstanding of what the story is really about. The scale of the story seems too grand to them, wondering how it could be possible for Noah to take all the animals of the world on one boat. This may be because many faithful believers in the story have probably been misunderstanding the scale of the story themselves. Genesis is attributed to Moses, but even if he didn't write the story down himself, the story was still originally written down by Hebrew people for Hebrew people in a time before they knew how big the planet was. At the time, they were only aware of 70 nations, comprising that we now know as North Africa and the Middle East. The story was part of an origin story for them, starting first with Adam, and then after the flood, starting again with Noah. They could trace their ancestral patriarch Abraham to Noah. This is what was important to the story for them. With that in mind, the context of the story is very likely to tell of a great flood from their perspective of the region they lived in and comprised the known world to them. We shouldn't assume they were including areas of the world they weren't even aware of at their time in history. With that in mind, it probably shouldn't be a surprise that the story in Genesis isn't the only story of the Great Flood to survive from the ancient world. It turns out the story of the Great Flood can be found all around the world. You can find similarities in the stories from around the world, but they are also unique in their own way, indicating a different perspective of the event. So although the Genesis story of Noah was likely a regional perspective of the event, it does appear that the event did affect the entire world, in many places by flooding, and others by darkened skies and a long, brutal winter. In my view, I think these stories provide plenty of evidence of a historical event. It is difficult to place exactly when this event occurred, though. It's one of the oldest stories known to man, but we don't know from the writings exactly when it happened. It's difficult to say for sure when it was even first written down, because we don't know for sure if the oldest written copies of the story we have are actually the first written copies, or if they are just copies of older copies that have since been lost. We also don't know how long prior to the written copies we have maybe an oral tradition that has been passed down. I do like my idea that the Younger Dryas event is where Adam's story starts, and the end of the Younger Dryas is when Noah's flood event story takes place, but I'm far from certain about that. I'm still open to other possibilities in the timeline, and I don't know if we will ever know for sure when the event took place. One fairly common element to these stories is the world had become so corrupted is that God, or in other stories outside of Genesis, some other divine figure or force of nature, felt the world needed to be cleansed of that corruption and started over fresh. I think the most important thing we should learn from this story is to not do evil, and just be glad the flood has long since subsided. Those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening.